Well, as we said earlier, everyone misjudged the situation, the Russians included, and what we have today is the result of everyone's misjudgment. We underestimated the Russians based on the first few weeks because the Russians deliberately went in there in pursuit of a very different set of goals and objectives. And we imputed to them all they were interested in was making the Minsk Accords actually work to get Ukrainians, equal Ukrainian Russians who were living in Ukraine, equality before the law, and get the two breakaway republics the recognition they deserve as effectively Russian enclaves and recognize the legitimacy of Russia's rule over Crimea. And then, neutrality for Ukraine, which I always felt would be a blessing, and indeed I think it would be now. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Now, here we are a year later, and the Russians have said, okay, you want to wage war, we're going to wage war, and they built a force to do that. But they also have to confront the reality that the weather has to cooperate, and it took them until December to really get this force in place and trained. And when January came, they didn't get the level of freezing that they wanted that would support maneuver. And so, they reverted to long-range attack and incremental moves in the south to consolidate control over the Dnipro River. When Bakhmut falls and the towns to their east of Bakhmut, that effectively is the end of the battle for the Dnipro, which is what everybody wants because it's the income-producing area. So once that's over and you get dry season finally and get past this muddy season, which is horrendous, then I think the movement begins. And how far will that go? Well, you just said something that's very important. If you're sitting in Moscow and you're hearing people say, we will stay with this to the bitter end. Our goal is to fatally weaken Russia, to drive out Putin, to potentially even dismember the state, and failing that, we're going to launch an Afghanistan-style insurgency. You hear this from Moscow, you're sitting in Moscow, you hear this. The only conclusion that you can reach is that I have to end this war, and the only way I can end it is to march several 100,000 Russian troops all the way to the Polish border. That's the problem. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and war is a government program. And so, the self-licking ice cream cone and all that. I mean, and in fact, I think we talked about this a year ago, that if the Russians succeed in taking the East, well, now what? Now they've left an enemy rump state dominated by the hardest right-wing Ukrainian nationalists in alliance with NATO and the Poles. That is going to be an even worse thorn in their side or an equal thorn in their side to the previous situation. So then they're just going to have to solve that problem. Then once they solve that problem, now they've just picked up 2 new NATO nations on their borders. Well, that's right, and that's something they obviously wanted to avoid. But my supposition, and perhaps I'm wrong, but my supposition is that by the time they've closed under Dnipro, the Europeans will say, that's enough, and they don't want this unrelenting insurgent warfare in western Ukraine under any circumstances. Very difficult to wage it there, to be blunt, because other than the Carpathian Mountains that are in the far west, the rest of western Ukraine is largely open, rolling countryside. So that's a tough place to run an insurgency. It ends up becoming simply a set of targets on a daily basis for Russian standoff attack weapons. But I think the Europeans will oppose that because there's always the danger if this drags on, how long before it starts spilling into Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Lithuania? And the Russians aren't interested in that. They don't want it to go on. The Europeans don't want it to go on. Of course, there's always the outside possibility that someone in Washington, D.C. wakes up and smells the coffee. I think that is possible because now I'm beginning to detect this new groundswell to justify enormous defense spending by talking about the looming China threat. And you've got to stop and ask yourself a question. If we're happy with what's happening in Ukraine, why are we now shifting the conversation to China? Yeah, and of course, the Chinese are many things, but they're certainly not a military threat in the way that they're being described. And far from it, I don't see any evidence for any Chinese interest in attacking the United States. I don't see any interest in the Chinese attacking Taiwan. And in fact, we know that the Taiwan government and Beijing are constantly talking to each other on back channels. It's not going to be a war there. So why are we talking about suddenly China again? I think they're trying to change the subject in anticipation of everything falling apart in Ukraine. Well, you know what? I would hate for them to hock it up against China full stop. even if it's an excuse to change the subject from Ukraine. But take it sort of the way they finally shut up about when the Ukraine thing broke out, well, at least they shut up about it. So, I don't know. Let's get back to China in a minute because I'm interested in your takes on that. It's really important stuff. But on the question of the presumed sooner or later, medium-term future here, loss of the Ukrainian military, and then the choice being either, we discussed the possibility of an insurgency, and then as you're saying, the Russians will need to take the whole west of the country if we do them like that, and the Europeans are going to want to stop. What about the other option that you brought up a couple of times now, which is what John Mearsheimer warned about last summer, which is that he thinks that Biden and his people are so committed to their rhetoric about making sure that this works that they will escalate. They'll use the U.S. Navy, they'll send in the Marines, they'll do something crazy and turn this into a real war between America and Russia. Now I guess changing the subject of China is one way out of that, but do you think that that is a real worry? Well, I don't know what the Marines would do. They're pretty light. Other than go if they were to enter the current theater of war, they'd be killed. They're not the U.S. Army. They don't have massive quantities of armor. In fact, the U.S. Army isn't the U.S. Army anymore. I think we'd be lucky to get 50,000 combat troops on the ground for any length of time out of this army of what, 450,000, 460,000? We just don't have that many people in the combat units with the right equipment. I don't think that happens. If you widen this to the use of the Navy, well, then surface vessels will be sunk in great quantities. The Russians rely heavily on their submarine fleet, and submarines are extremely difficult to deal with. We'd end up in some long and tiring exercise with our submarines attacking theirs or trying to find them. And then, of course, that would halt all transatlantic movement immediately. So that means you can't resupply anybody over there unless you use aircraft. And even then, I think that would be hazardous. The Russians may decide to shoot everything down that comes across the Atlantic. I'm not sure that's true. My own thinking is that they will try to change the subject as it becomes clear that this is a disaster. What happened when Washington left Vietnam, which was clearly a disaster? Well, they stopped talking about it. Right. And the same thing happened when we left Afghanistan and Iraq too. What the mainstream media stopped talking about when Ukraine is destroyed or in ruins, they probably won't say much about it. But again, I think NATO will split rather dramatically along many lines. There will be a push for talks with the Russians. It will have to be from new governments in places like Germany and Berlin. The Russians aren't going to pay any attention to Schultz, and they certainly aren't going to pay attention to the Biden administration as long as it's around. So there'll have to be new governments in Europe, and then I think we'll just walk away, and the focus will turn entirely to China. Which is crazy because, I hear people contact me, say, look at what the Chinese are doing to us with fentanyl. Well, the Chinese aren't doing anything to us with fentanyl. The Chinese are supplying the ingredients for fentanyl to the so-called drug cartels in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. They are, in turn, weaponizing those and sending them back into the United States. Well, if you want to stop that, it's a very straightforward solution. You secure your border, you secure your ports, you control immigration. Somebody told me recently over in DHS, Doug, 20,000 Russians entered the United States last year. Okay, where are they? What are they doing? I'm sure most of them are quite happy to be in the United States, but it would seem unlikely that out of that 20,000, there weren't several agents working for Moscow. Well, that does begin to address the thousands of Chinese that have been pouring into our country over those open borders. Where are they? No, what are they doing? Don't worry, you can trust the FBI Counterintelligence Division. They're not too busy framing the last president for treason. They'll take care of that. Well, it seems like when the neoconservatives really seized control of American policy after the Cold War, I guess in the aftermath of it with the defense planning guidance and then, of course, PNAC and all of that stuff, that Charles Kupchan called it the unipolar moment. And they understood that now that the Soviet Union is out of the way, that we have this period of time, a generation, if we're lucky, To set the table on the planet exactly how we want it before naturally the rest of the world gets rich enough that their opinion will start to matter more. And so India and Brazil and China and Russia again, eventually they will have to have a seat at the table, and it will look more like a multipolar world. The whole contest was to see how well America can set the structure of the thing up by the time those nations rise up to fill their place. Now it's a generation later, 30 years later, but the Americans can't accept that what they thought was going to happen happened. The time went on, and those other countries got richer and more powerful, and now their opinion matters a little bit. China's not taking over the world like they say on Fox News, it's just rising up to take its place at the table where America was taking up, 6 of the 10 seats or whatever it is, if I'm making sloppy metaphors. But the point is, though, that why can't they remember that it only ever was to be a unipolar moment, that this is just the middle part of North America, that we cannot, never mind may not, we cannot be the dominant power in Eurasia forever. It just can't work, it doesn't work. I think of perpetual revolution, and that America should be its instrument. This is reminiscent of the Trotskyite Bolsheviks. Ultimately, Stalin dislodged and expelled as many of them as possible because they kept arguing for this internationalist position that would drag the Soviet Union into war with its neighbors. His argument was, well, the first thing we need to do here in the Soviet Union is consolidate and build. We don't need war with the West or anyone right now. What we need to do is consolidate our industries, re-examine what we're doing, and develop new economic policies. We need real security for the United States and the Western Hemisphere. No one wants to go there because this is not part of the larger money machine. Well, that money machine needs to stop, and the only way to stop it, I'm afraid, is probably with some measure of bankruptcy. I think our economic or financial system is about to tip over. That's going to have an impact. We're certainly back where we were in 2008, only much worse. These proverbial chickens will come home to roost, and there will probably be an opportunity then to do some things differently and take care of business here at home. I don't see any other force arresting it right now other than the economic reality that we confront. Do you? No, sir. I mean, that's always been the contest for 20 years. Can the economic catastrophe, the impending collapse of our phony economic system and monetary system, save us from nuclear war? Ultimately, that's going to be the contest because, as Ron Paul said, no one will listen, it's just we're going to run out of money at some point. The question is whether we run out of money before the H-bombs start flying because the Americans just can't stand the fact that Russia and China exist without yielding to just do exactly as they're told. But it's a pretty big planet, you know? I don't know how they think they could run China out of Washington, D.C. If they had a guy in there, you know what I mean? He'd probably just let them be. It's not a question of running them out, it's a question of doing business in a way that is profitable and mutually beneficial. We haven't done that. We have too many greedy people with too many short-term interests. There's no long-term consideration, and there's an acute lack of devotion to the country. It's a huge problem, and it's not going to fix itself quickly. But I think the economic dimension is going to facilitate some change in the right direction. How we react to it is another matter. Right now, there are a lot of people in this country, much more so than I remember at any time in the last 20 years, who seem to be angry and seem to be acutely sensitive to all of these things. We'll just have to see how it plays out politically, but right now, I think a lot of people have also discovered that these two parties don't really amount to much. There has to be a third force, some new force in American politics, because the two parties are basically rooted in the same swamp, are they not? Yeah, they certainly are. Well, we're trying over at the Libertarian Party. It's a grand reopening over there, and we're doing everything we can. But let me ask you this, Colonel, because you have this legendary experience in the U.S. Army and all of that. Even though it's Ike Eisenhower himself who coined the phrase military-industrial complex, it's not the way they tell the story on TV. In fact, that's a conspiracy theory. Even if it's not the Freemasons, it's still too corrupt for America to be run that way. I was just wondering if you could tell us about your experience actually in the Army and just what you know about what effect money has on things like whether you guys are driving the kinds of tanks that you would be driving if it was up to you. Or whether you're driving the kind of tank that a lobbyist sold to a congressman for reasons that have very little to do with you guys and your performance out in the field or whatever. Things like that to let people know the degree to which you believe that you have this kind of perverse incentive just built in from these various contractors and arms manufacturers and the role that they play in setting the policy in the Pentagon and in the rest of D.C. Keep in mind that most soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, warrant officers, majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels have very little exposure to what you're discussing. They simply follow orders and do the best they can with whatever they're provided. Occasionally, they will raise questions about the quality of something, but the same is true in the Navy. When I was doing some work years ago for the Office of Secretary of Navy, one of the things that we found out when we talked to people from the fleet was that the fleet would ask for effective shotguns as an analogy, and several years later, they were given laser pistols that didn't work. In other words, whatever you asked for isn't necessarily what you get because decisions are made at a very high level to invest in something that may not be proven, that may be problematic, but it's a money maker. Shipbuilding and tank building all have supporters on the Hill, as well as in the industry and in the districts and states where they're manufactured. Not all the right decisions are made. When we came out of Desert Storm, virtually all of us that served on M101 tanks pointed to the enormous problems associated with the tank's turbine engine. It burns jet fuel at a very high rate, whether sitting still or moving. After 7 or 8 hours of operation, the tank runs out of fuel. It emits a thermal signal that can be viewed from space, which poses problems for combat operations. We all suggested getting rid of it and replacing it with a solid, high-performance diesel engine, much like the one in the Leopard tank. However, nothing changed. It's still there because someone has an interest in Washington, D.C., in keeping it that way, even though it's not in the interest of warfighting. It's a problem. I think Eisenhower was right, and of course, he was in a different era and was worried about it, but I don't think even in his wildest imagination he envisioned what we confront today. We're back to the original question, will the economic downturn that we all agree is coming help us solve this problem? I don't know, it depends on an awful lot and who ultimately ends up in power in the midst of the chaos. We have no way of knowing who or what that will be. Yeah, well, Ron Paul says that ultimately, even in the Soviet Union, the people get the government that they deserve and demand. If people won't go along with it anymore, then it won't work, and it really is up to us. Even if we don't control exactly the levers of power, if we had a real consensus in this country among the hundreds of millions of us that we don't want to do this anymore, then they would have to stop. That's true, and I think just to circle back a little bit to what's happening in Ukraine today, the Russian population is overwhelmingly behind Vladimir Putin and his government. They are incensed at what we've tried to do to them in Ukraine, and they want blood. We should be very grateful that Putin has exercised tremendous influence and restraint over these people because if the Russian populace were to have its way, Ukraine would probably go out of existence. They'd steamroll over the place, that's how angry they are. So, you're right, popular sentiment makes a difference, and it has made a huge difference in Russia. We need to be more sensitive to it than we are. But, again, when you get chaos as a result of this coming economic downfall, we will find out who is going to step in and who is going to lead. The population will have a chance to either support or reject what they don't want because they'll be interested. They'll be interested because they want to eat, they want to heat their homes, they want to drive their cars, if you get my drift. I think it is going to be like that. And look, it's clear that a huge part of our problem right now is that the Biden government is the Obama government. The people who did the coup of 2014, who started the war, and who can never take responsibility for any of it. So, never mind if it was Donald Trump up there or anyone like that, but just if it was some random Democrat governor from out west somewhere. I don't mean that horrible guy from California, but some guy you never heard of, just some Democrat politician sitting in that chair, that would be one thing. But this is Biden and Sullivan and Blinken and Newland, the ones who got us into this mess in the first place. It makes it really difficult. So, you're definitely right. It takes both sides, right? It takes the American people understanding what the problem is and being determined to do something about it. And then that thing being removing people like this from the decision-making because, look at what they've got us into. People are talking about, and in fact, I'll let you go after you answer one last one here for me. You mentioned this earlier at the top of the show, and it has been brought up over and over again, the possibility that this could come to a nuclear war. If you just have one or two steps, it's not that slippery slope of a fallacy to say that within the space of a week or two, this thing could really escalate to war between NATO and Russia, and even H-bombs. I think it's possible but unlikely, simply for the following reasons. First of all, the Russians want nothing to do with it, and they've made that pretty clear routinely by their actions as well as their words. They know under what circumstances something would happen, and it will not happen unless we attack them. Secondly, I see no evidence that anyone at the top of the Defense Department, even though I think these are some of the least impressive people that we've had in the history of the United States, one thing I can say for them is that they very clearly don't want a war with Russia, and they absolutely have warned against the use of any nuclear weapon. I also think that Blinken understands the gravity of the situation when you involve nuclear weapons. Now, I can't vouch for the rest of the bunch. I don't know who calls the shots, Susan Rice, Samantha Powers, whoever. I don't know what they think. I don't know what the neocons that they're listening to think, per se. But at least in those two instances, there's an understanding that what you just described is the ultimate nightmare, and it's one that we absolutely want to avoid.